Edward III was the King of England and Ireland from 1327 until his death in 1377. He was famous for his victories in the 100 Years' War. His 50-year reign was one of the longest in English history. Edward transformed the Kingdom of England into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. He outlived his eldest son Edward the Black Prince, and the throne passed to his grandson, Richard II. Edward was born at Windsor Castle, to King Edward II of England and Isabella of France. His parents were married largely for diplomatic reasons and to produce an heir. The reign of his father was a problematic period of English history. One source of contention was the king's inactivity and repeated failure in war with Scotland. The birth of male heir temporarily improved Edward II's position in relation to the baronial opposition. Isabella spent most of her time in France with the young Edward. There she openly took a lover, the English baron and anti-royalist Roger Mortimer. The couple plotted to attack England and depose Edward II. Having lost the support of his barons and military incompetence regarding Scotland, the English king could do nothing to stop Isabella. Edward was obliged to formally abdicate, and he was then imprisoned and murdered in Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire in 1327 AD. With his father's demise, Edward at the age of 14 was declared King of England, with Isabella and Mortimer acting as his regents. Mortimer was now the de facto ruler of England. He used his power to acquire noble estates and titles, and his unpopularity grew, with humiliating defeat by the Scots at the Battle of Stanhope Park. Edward decided to take direct action against Mortimer. Aided by his close companions, and a small number of other trusted men, he took Mortimer by a surprise. Mortimer was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and later executed as a traitor, while his mother was banished to a life of confinement at Castle Rising. Edward married Philippa of Hainault, with whom he had 13 children. His most famous son was his eldest, Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. Edward became one of the greatest of all medieval knights. Both father and son would bring about a new golden era for England. Scotland's independence had been secured by Treaty of Northampton, but Edward had not given up on the dream of his grandfather to conquer the country. When the Scottish King Robert the Bruce died, after a 23-year reign, his successor was David II, only 5 years old. They attempted to install Edward Balliol as King of Scotland, in place of the infant David II, but Balliol was soon expelled, and was forced to seek the help of Edward III. The English king responded by laying siege to the important border town of Berwick, and defeated large army at the Battle of Halidon Hill. He reinstated Balliol on the throne, and received a substantial amount of land in Scotland. Eventually David gradually regained control of the country. Edward was forced to agree to truce with the Scots. The French carried out raids on English coastal towns, leading to rumors in England of a full-scale French invasion. So, Edward turned his attention to the richer prize of France. The French succession was governed by the Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through a female, and they naturally preferred a Frenchman as their ruler. So French rejected Edward's claim. As the grandson and nephew of the last Capetian kings, Edward courted the lilies of France with the lions of England in his coat of arms, and formally claimed the French throne. By doing so, Edward began what later came to be known as the 100 Years' War. The conflict was to last for 116 years from 1337 to 1453. In 1340, French fleet intended to invade England, was sunk by an English fleet at Sluys. 190 French ships of 200 were destroyed or captured. This was followed up by an extraordinary land victory over Philip VI at Crécy-en-Ponthieu, a small town between Paris and Calais. The Battle of Crécy was fought in 1346, where a heavily outnumbered English army of around 15,000 defeated French force around 30,000 to 40,000. Edward then laid siege to the port of Calais, which after a long drawn-out siege, eventually fell into English hands. Edward III was at the very peak of his success. The war with Scotland was resumed. Robert the Bruce was long dead, but his successor David II seized the chance to attack England, while Edward's attention was engaged in France. David invaded England, and Durham was the target, but an English army led by William Le Zouche, Archbishop of York, defeated the Scots and David was captured. Disaster struck England in Edward III's reign, in the form of bubonic plague or the Black Death, which spread across Europe in the 14th century, killing a third of its population. It struck terror in the hearts of the medieval population of Europe. Many in that superstitious age saw it as the vengeance of God. The population of England was decimated. The disaster interrupted the 100 Years' War, but the conflict was resumed, following the succession of Philip's son John the Good. Edward's son, the Black Prince, won a great victory against the massive French force at Poitiers. French King John was captured. Back in England, David II was released as part of the Treaty of Berwick, where the Scots paid a ransom, and 10-year truce was agreed between the two countries. Edward then marched with a massive army to Reims in 1359, fully intending to become the King of French. Reims proved impregnable, and harsh winter reduced Edward's army, and he was obliged to start peace talks. In 1360, a treaty was signed between England and France. Under the Treaty of Bretigny, Edward's claim to 25% of France was recognized. In return, he gave up any ambition for French crown. Unfortunately for Edward, holding on to his lands in France proved much more difficult than acquiring them. A new French king, Charles V of France, proved to be much more worthy opponent than his predecessors. Charles began to grab back what his predecessors had lost by avoiding open battle, and relying on the safety of his castles when required. The English king was also struggled to pay for his hugely expensive wars. Edward imposed repeated taxes on his subjects. Charles' strategies proved worthy. By 1375, the only lands left in France to the English crown were Calais and a slice of Gascony. By the end of his reign, Edward was becoming increasingly unpopular, and there were no more victories in France. Edward suffered a stroke, and never really recovering, he died on the 21st of June 1377. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. Unfortunately, a well-respected Black Prince, Edward's son, was also died, the year before. His 10-year-old grandson, King Richard II, became King of England.